Thanks so much for that. Brought back a lot of memories. Actually, I think let me tell you guys a little bit about my background because what it does is it helps you understand the lens I use to look at the world, right? So I basically did a PhD in distributed systems at Princeton, and before getting into this decentralized computing world, I was building cloud computing platforms, and before that, I was doing peer-to-peer networking research, right? So I entered this world from with a lens of academia. I work in distributed systems where we pride ourselves in building real systems, and actually, some of the internet infrastructure that has been built came from our research community, and we were looking at this new concept of Bitcoin and blockchain. And what you heard about in 2014, what we launched, basically, we thought that payments and money or currency is a very limited subset of the application of this technology, right? So what we launched was a general purpose decentralized application. And at that time, we had to call it non-financial applications of the blockchain, right? So this is early enough where people would, associate blockchains with Bitcoin and payments, right? And we had to kind of like carve out this use case that, hey, listen, this is actually a general purpose computing platform. Like after cloud computing, this is the next kind of like wave of computing, new computing infrastructure and platform that has very different properties. And you can pretty much build anything on top of this. Yes, we have to solve certain fundamental problems while we figure out kind of like the core substrate of this computing platform. But there's no limitation that only payments is an application here, right? So that's what we did. Blockstack, you can think of that as a software platform for building decentralized apps. And it's a new network. So if you publish your app on the Blockstack network, or if you're a user and you register your username on the Blockstack network, then you can start using these applications. So one benefit is that you can avoid situations like these, right? And if you try to break apart, like what does it mean to decentralize? For me, what it actually means is that it's about freedom of choice, in the sense that once you start depending on a bunch of large monopolies, users actually have very limited choices, right? Like imagine that you're dependent on software produced by a single company that's a monopoly versus an open market, right? I tend to believe that open markets can actually deliver better products. The same thing happens in other industries as well. If consumers have a lot of choice, if you walk into a mall and you actually have like 10 different choices of a product that you want to buy, that's better for you. You're in control, right? Those companies have to compete over different properties or prices and trying to win you over, versus the situation that we have on the internet now, where there are basically three big companies, three large monopolies, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, and they control most of the internet, right? So that's a very important part of why decentralization matters. The second thing, and this is, I think the mental model here is to think about real life. And as our real life is becoming more and more important, connected to the internet or the digital life, we don't have the concept of property rights online, right? And historically, if you look at nations that didn't have the concept of property rights actually lacked in prosperity in general, right? It's a basic human right. Once you introduce it to any area, any country, any nation, time and time, over and over again, we have seen that it actually helps empower people, right? I was born and raised in Pakistan. There are some areas there where there are still people who cannot own property and they are dependent on their landlords. And it is very hard for them to actually improve their livelihood. And we are in a similar situation with our digital lives. There's no concept of property rights online. And one of the reasons why I got really interested in blockchain technology was that it actually, for the first time, defines property rights online using mathematics and cryptography, right? So imagine that now suddenly you can own things online, like truly own something, right? So you have the private key, and you can actually own either a currency like Bitcoin, or you can own your own username, for example, on Blockstack, or your data, right? And you are the only owner. You're not dependent on any company. That changes the dynamics of how technology works. And I think it's one of the most fundamental shifts that we have seen in many decades. The third thing, so I've spent my fair share of time in Silicon Valley, and over there, like if you're walking around San Francisco, you would notice that there are these large tech companies or people who have done really well by being early in tech. And at the same time, there are like homeless people walking around San Francisco, or people who are worried about their homes being taken from them because they cannot participate in this internet economy. It's almost like they're living in a different world. If you work in tech, you are actually part of a different world, a different economy, and the normal person doesn't have access to that economy anymore, right? And one thing that we are seeing with decentralization and with these crypto projects is that they're not going around raising traditional capital. There are new models for actually supporting these projects. And if you're an early believer, or if you're a user who actually now has access to own like a small stake of the pie and grow with the ecosystem, right? These are the kind of opportunities that were simply not available to majority of the population before, right? So for the first time, we can have this concept of a shared internet economy where it's not just the VCs and the early founders and startups that are actually benefiting from this economy, but normal people can as well. And of course, there are tons of regulations and compliance problems around this technology, but there are ways to actually solve them and have a more fair way of building technology. So these are the three things why decentralization matters to me, and why I get excited about working on Blockstack when I wake up. So I describe Blockstack as a platform for building applications. Sometimes people define it as a new internet, because that's what it feels like. You have a new browser, you have a new, almost like, just like you go to CNN.com or Facebook.com, you can go to new types of domains. You can download new types of applications. So for a technical audience specifically, I like to give this disclaimer that we are actually not trying to reinvent the wheel. We are reusing most of the early internet protocols. They were designed in a way that they're already decentralized. Right? When DARPA funded most of the early research for the internet, one of their design requirements was that this network should be able to survive a nuclear attack, meaning that there are no central points of failure for the underlying layers, and it can route around problems. But what started happening at the application layer, another mental model I have is that imagine that we were building this beautiful like skyscraper, and the original pioneers or the founding fathers of the internet, they just left the job unfinished, right? So the last layer, the topmost layer, the application layer, it lacked certain core features that should have been part of the internet infrastructure, but they were never there. So then these companies kind of like came in and filled the gap. Like for example, Facebook came in and built an authentication protocol, which is a great thing in general. But what that means is that now anyone who is using Facebook Auth is dependent on a single company, and that company can track every single application that you're using, or can share that information with advertisers, and then nasty things like the Cambridge Analytica stuff that you saw happen, right? So these are core internet infrastructure components that should have been part of the internet to begin with. And in a way, what we are doing is we are finishing that job. There's actually an event called the Decentralized Web Summit. The first event was in 2016, and it just happened recently. I was there in the first one as well, and now recently. And interestingly, they were able to get most of the founding fathers of the internet. And it was a really moving experience to see that the tiny projects that you're working on and the beliefs that we have, the founding fathers of the internet share those beliefs. They themselves think that there's something wrong with the internet, that it's a job unfinished, and we need to change something here, right? So that was a very interesting moment where it's not like we are saying that, hey, the internet was built the wrong way. The people who built it are saying that it was built the wrong way, and they're trying to do the same thing that we are trying to do, right? I think I should introduce the concept of decentralized apps versus traditional apps. You should think of this as there's a new computing model now, right? Just like initially you used to have mainframes, right? I'm talking about the 70s, the 80s. And the computing model at that time was you would have a dumb terminal. It was just a screen. And you would send all of your compute jobs to a big mainframe, your computer the size of this room or bigger. And all the processing power and data would be stored with the mainframe. This is how the world works for a couple of decades. Then desktops happen. And if you notice like this nostalgia for desktops or this nostalgia for the early days of the internet, I think the reason was that for the first time you had your own computer, right? You could own your own data. You could run whatever program you wanted to. You could connect online and directly communicate with anyone you wanted to, right? And slowly we started moving back to cloud computing, which is actually mainframes all over again. Like this device is pretty much like a dumb screen now. If the internet connection goes down and I can't talk to Google or I can't talk to Amazon, I can't do anything useful on this computer. So it was a pendulum swing going back to a centralized version of computing. And what you're noticing with crypto protocols, even though the press headlines might be all about the price of Bitcoin or some scams that are happening, underlying all of that community is actually a fundamental shift in computing technology. And that's the thing that excites most of the people that I respect in this community and who work here. So there's a lot of noise, but if you look deep enough, there are really smart, really intelligent people who are absolutely convinced that this is the next wave of computing. And most new applications would actually be built this way, right? So the analogy would be that most people are working on mainframes, and some developers decided that, no, I'm going to start building desktop apps because desktops are going to take over the world, right? So we're doing that to cloud computing. What happens with a traditional app versus a decentralized app is that traditionally, now developers are used to, okay, I'm building an app. I have to rent some sort of a VM on Amazon or somewhere else. I have to set up a database. I have to set up some sort of a login system. Maybe it's Facebook auth, or I come up with my own username and password. And then I'll store all the information for users on my database, on my servers. And I want to get millions of users who would get certain utility from the app. In decentralized computing, you only focus on the logic of your own app, right? Users bring their own storage. Users download the app, and they run it on their own computing devices. So they're bringing their own computing power. They're bringing their own storage. And you're actually not liable for storing any of that data. Better yet, if you suddenly get like millions of users, you're not racking up cloud computing bills because you are not paying for their resources, right? And I think what happens here is that it also changes the structure around business models. There's basically just one dominant business model on the internet right now, and that's advertising, right? So the model is you give out your product for free. You try to get as much information about the users as possible, and then you try to monetize that information. In decentralized computing, you have no access to user information, so you have to come up with other types of business models, right? And those business models can actually be more healthy. There could be a sustainable ecosystem where, let's take Twitter, for example. I, as a user, would gladly pay a developer who builds, for example, a minimalist app for Twitter that lets me block notification or doesn't let me like tweet that often and things like that. But it cannot exist because Twitter, the company, won't allow it to exist. Twitter, the company, has done things like there was a startup called Meerkat that innovated on top of Twitter and was going viral, and they shut down access to Meerkat and went and bought a competitor, Periscope, right? So the problem that developers face now is that they don't even have information that the monopolies have. No, I don't have access to the social graph that Facebook is sitting on. I don't have access to the data that Google is collecting on all the users. In decentralized computing, it's a more fair ground, right? Like it's harder to build monopolies like Facebook and Google here, but maybe it's also a bigger economy, right? So sometimes I get this pushback that how would the next $100 billion company be made in decentralized computing? And my answer is always that it might be a bigger pie, right? Where everyone can have a larger slice instead of a few companies who become inefficient. Look at LinkedIn. I think a 5 or 10% team working for 6 months could probably make a better interface for LinkedIn than that giant. And it doesn't happen because LinkedIn blocks access to developers for all the data that they're sitting on, right? In decentralized apps, the data is with the users. Any developer can request access. If the user says, yes, I give access, the apps would have to compete on quality, right? Which doesn't happen these days. So to understand like these apps a little bit more, what happens traditionally, let's say Evernote, it's a note-taking platform. It would ask you to either sign in with one of the options like Google or Facebook, or it will basically say create a new account. Graphite is an app built on top of Blockstack. It's an alternative to Google Docs, so you can like keep notes here as well. With Graphite, you are putting data in your personal data locker, which the Blockstack software kind of enables you to do. And once you've created a single universal ID, you never have to make another account online ever again, right? All you have to do is basically say yes to the sign-in request from Graphite. There's actually no difference between signing up and signing in again, right? So it actually reduces the friction for trying out new applications. Sometimes, there's a new app and I just don't want to go through their sign-up process. Now, because I have a universal username that I own, I am basically just clicking a button and saying, yes, I want to try out this new application that's there. So that's a fundamental shift in how applications are built and what people need to do to even like get started and using them. I think the biggest thing is about data, and that's what I've been talking about mostly. That in the case of Evernote, Evernote is keeping all the data, right? And they're responsible for creating backups. In the decentralized world, what we have built is a storage system called Gaia. And what we have done there is that we are trying to take the reliability of cloud computing and the performance of cloud computing, and then we are taking the decentralization properties where no single company can actually own your data and combining them. So what happens is that we have built this, I don't want to get too technical here, but we have built this wide area file system that puts encrypted data blobs wherever you want to put them, right? So just like the good old days of desktops where people had this understanding that they're supposed to back up their data, right? There's a hard drive, you put some data there, and you're supposed to back up your data on some other hard drive. We are converting most of the cloud providers into dumb drives like a hard drive, right? So they have no visibility into what data you're putting there. You can choose to replicate your data on S3 or Google or a Linux server that you run or just your device that you have, right? And we write drivers. Those of you who used computers in the 90s would remember that if you didn't have the right driver for a hard drive, you couldn't actually start using it. That problem doesn't exist anymore. But that's exactly what we do with cloud storage providers. We just reduce them to dumb drives, and they're not going to like that. But that's okay. Yes, so it's fully encrypted. Let's say that when you put a file on Dropbox, Dropbox engineers have access to it, right? Wherever they're creating their backups, those people, like those data center employees, have access to it. Any hackers have access to it. Any governments who would just like ask that, hey, I need access to this information, they have access to it. In our model, because you're encrypting data before it leaves your device, none of those people have access to it as long as you believe in mathematics and cryptography. It is GDPR compliant by default, and we actually have applications built on top of Blockstack that are selling to enterprise customers because they are GDPR compliant out of the box. So third thing is app discovery. So this is a very interesting area. Most people depend on, even without thinking about it, they depend on two companies, Apple and Google, to discover most of their applications. Right? Apple runs an app store, Google runs another app store, and developers of these applications would fight tooth and nail to get a prominent spot in these app stores. Right? What we have done is that we have created almost like a decentralized mechanism for discovering applications. Developers can just publish these apps on the network, and then there could be different curated lists or app stores that are built on top. But no single company has a monopoly over having an app store or having so much control over these apps. I remember reading a story where, actually it was back-to-back stories. One story was Uber was valued at $80 billion. And a couple of days later, there was a story about how Apple is threatening to remove Uber from the Apple App Store. And I just like remember this feeling that for someone who's built a company worth $80 billion, Apple can push a button and you don't exist anymore. Right? This is how much power Apple has over some of the people who are publishing apps in the App Store. Right? So this is a fundamental layer to create a more fair internet, to create a more fair digital economy. You need to have this layer built in a way that everyone has access to it. So no one can get censored from publishing their apps on this platform. And that's why I would recommend you to go to check out app.co. It's our very initial version of basically an app store that builds on top of such technology, but anyone else can actually start another app store like this because the underlying network is open and decentralized. Another interesting thing that we're doing is that in our new blockchain, there's this concept of miners, right? And when people think of miners, they think of, most people don't understand what miners are or why the hell they're called miners. But if you do, you would think of like them as solving some sort of like puzzles, some computing puzzles or cryptographic puzzles, and then they're getting rewarded for it because they're increasing the security of the network. We are broadening that concept. A miner is anyone who's providing some useful service to the network, right? So you need some miners who are doing these computing calculations because it helps the security of the network. But similarly, if you're a developer and you're actually building applications that adds to the utility of the network, then you should get rewarded as well. Just like miners get some share of the tokens that are being released, app developers can get a share of the tokens on our blockchain. And this is something that we haven't fully launched yet because I think there are two things that we are extremely careful of. One is quality of engineering. Like our team is basically, I think we have like 5 PhDs in distributed systems on board, and we don't feel comfortable saying that this is scalable or this is secure unless we actually really think that yes, it is, right? So we have actually gone out of our way and published some of this research in traditional distributed systems venues. This is not one of those projects where someone writes a white paper and sticks it on a website. We have gone through rigorous peer review for some of this technology. But at the same time, we're also extremely careful about regulations, right? So one of the reasons why this app mining is not fully live yet, although we're getting there, I'm talking order of months, is because we have been working with regulators for a very long time to figure out a legal framework in which these tokens can be distributed to people without putting either us or them into any non-compliance issues. Say that again, please. It's about all types of regulators, right? So people, these tokens, sometimes they start looking like securities because people are selling them publicly to anyone without following. App mining has some tokens that are going to developers. So there are certain regulations that automatically kick in. Yes, I think like most of the regulators, they kick in either because of the token part of it, if they think the token is a currency or the token is a security, or they kick in if they feel that this technology is enabling, harmful acts on the internet that cannot be censored, right? So, and in both cases, like unfortunately, I can't even comment in more details because the regulators stop you from doing so. The fourth and final thing here that makes decentralized apps different is this, again, this is another form of the property rights that you can now create digital assets that you could never create on the traditional internet. So take like something as simple as a game, right? And you created some sort of an asset. Let's say I created an avatar in a game, and for some reason, because I had so much free time, that I ended up being a famous player in that game, right? And now there is someone who wants to buy that avatar. It has some value. With blockchains, you can actually have almost like a real object and a real owner of that digital asset. You can even transfer it outside of the game to another game or to another exchange, and people can actually trade that. This thing is, I think, one of the most undervalued properties of blockchains that I've seen, because it can just like transform not just the gaming industry, but people would come up with new ways of digital property. Like software licenses is just a digital property thing, right? Like one company is saying, yes, you have this software license. You can actually issue that license on a blockchain. You can trade it, you can transfer it, you can resell it. And I think that's one of the most underappreciated aspects of decentralized computing, because these concepts were just not there in cloud computing. With that, I'm going to switch over to some of the recent things that we have been up to, just to keep, because I feel like wherever we go, there are some community members who are actually like hardcore Blockstack community members. Some people are just hearing about it for the first time, but the recent updates tend to be interesting for both of these audiences. I talked about our Stacks blockchain. We did a token offering last year. I think, like, don't take my word for it, but this was a period where if you could write some sort of a white paper that would make some sense, people would just throw money at you, right? And I started in this industry in 2013. We had production systems running for 4 years. We had real technology, and still we were extremely careful about the amount of money that we were going to raise. We, quote unquote, only raised $50 million, but most of that money is actually under self-imposed restrictions, meaning that we only took 20% of that money for doing R&D work, and the rest of the money is behind milestones, right? So they're completely self-imposed on ourselves, where if we don't push this new network live, we don't get 80% of the capital, and investors get their money back. And the next milestone is that if we don't actually get usage on the network, we don't hit a certain threshold of users, investors get 40% of their money back, right? So one update is that the testnet of our blockchain actually went live 5 months ago. The technology is there, and we are actually getting pretty close to launch. I'll have another update for that later. We've been doing a lot of work with regulators. Some of my team members, they joke so that if I ever decide to go back to school, I should get a JD this time around. I don't know if I want to go back to school ever, but I've been doing a lot more work with regulators and just legal frameworks than I would like to. One of those initiatives is actually opening new think tanks in DC and trying to actually influence policy. And we've been working on some legal frameworks that if they get the kind of approvals that we think that they might be able to, they would open up the path for other high quality engineers who just want to comply, right? Like they are scared of this space because of all the Wild West kind of activity that's going on, but they would be happy to enter if there's a straightforward way for them to feel comfortable that, yes, this is fully compliant under all regulations and law, and I can actually start a decentralized computing company. So we are pretty excited about this. Apps that are built on Blockstack, they're actually getting traction, which makes me really happy. So one of the apps is called Stealthy. Think of this as a really secure messaging app. Like, I know Signal is secure, but Signal still runs servers, so you depend on them for reliability. If the Signal servers go down, you actually can't talk to each other. But Stealthy is fully decentralized, fully encrypted, unstoppable, and it actually scales out, right? So it's not the case that you're actually sending a transaction on a blockchain or paying a fee every time you're trying to communicate. This actually scales out because in our design, we make use of blockchains as minimally as possible. And we use we basically use a decade of lessons that people learned in cloud computing and apply that to this next wave of computing for getting scalability. They recently launched at TechCrunch, and they were one of the participants in their TechCrunch competition. A large part of what we are doing, since we've been building the technology for many years, is actually now education. This Decentralizing the World tour is part of that. We also started a podcast. It's called the Internet 3.0 podcast. And we have got guests like, so Albert Wenger, he's an investor from Union Square Ventures who did our seed round and our Series A round, was the first guest. They have a very interesting perspective because they were the earliest investors in things like Twitter, Zynga, and they saw them all the way from a small company to a public company. And they were also one of the earliest investors in crypto with Coinbase and Filecoin and us and a bunch of others. And it's very interesting to see them draw parallels for the kind of like the last wave of technology that took off, mostly social networks and mobile apps, and this wave with crypto protocols. So this episode is live. We've had other guests like Brendan Eich, who invented JavaScript and has the Brave browser. And we have a bunch of other guests in the pipeline that you'll hear about soon. I don't know if people here watch the Silicon Valley show. It's a pretty big deal in the US. And the season 5 was all about building a decentralized internet. I couldn't publicly acknowledge this, but now because the season is live, me and my co-founder Ryan, we were actually technical advisors to the show. And it's partly based on the stuff that happens at Blockstack, right? So if you want to get a feel of what is it like if you're trying to build a decentralized internet, I think watching this show would give you some idea. And lastly, I was talking about our blockchain. We had around 8,000 people participate in our token offering last year. Like these are people who are not accredited investors. We actually couldn't take their money. And we just told them that come back once we have figured out the legal framework, and we'll give you the same price as the accredited investors who were able to participate. We've been privately communicating with a lot of those accredited investors who will get their tokens in the Genesis block. So if any of them happen to be here, you know what I'm talking about. But very soon, we will make a bunch of this information public because we are launching our Genesis block and the new Stacks blockchain soon. As I said, that this is part of a series. We're going to different cities. I think Hong Kong is going to be a big one. And one thing that I found really interesting was we announced Decentralizing the World tour in maybe 5 or 6 cities, and then 25 different meetups just popped up where community members were like, I want to host an event in this city as well. I want to host an event in that city as well. So that's the kind of thing that keeps our team energized, that when we are trying to do something, there's grassroots support for the mission that we have and the thing that we are trying to build. So I'm less excited about the events that we are organizing. I'm more excited about the grassroots ones and hoping to go to as many of them as I can. With that, thank you. Twitter is a good way to reach me. Otherwise, you can find my information on our website as well. And we can take some questions. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So for those of you who don't know what smart contracts are, there's this concept that you can just publish code, right? It runs on other people's computers, and you get benefit from it. So another name for code that you publish and it runs on other people's computers is remote code execution, and that is something that scares people. Like imagine that you go on a random website and it says, download this piece of software and run it on your computer. Some alarms would go off that this could be malicious to my computer. Interestingly, it's not just that in practice this is a problem if someone else can just run any software on your computer. In theoretical computer science, we know that this is an unsolvable problem where you cannot analyze that this program would ever actually finish processing, because whatever is trying to analyze that would also never finish processing, right? So it's called the halting problem. And it's not like we don't know that there is no solution. We know that there never will be a solution, right? Smart contracts start entering those dangerous territories, right? Where they are just, in the current form, we are seeing Turing-complete languages, and we are basically seeing a lot of power that is given to these programs, which are running remotely. Plus, they're implemented in an extremely inefficient manner where everyone on the network basically needs to do the same computation, right? So an analogy would be that if you want to connect to the internet, the requirement is first go visit every single website that was ever built on the internet, not just now, but in history. Process all of those websites, including the malicious ones, and then you can connect to this network and now do jobs for other people, right? This is an extremely, extremely inefficient and dangerous ways of doing smart contracts. With that said, smart contracts as a concept are extremely interesting. And that's why you're seeing all the excitement about them. Because people get excited about the possibilities. That, oh, can I just take this thing and write it take some law, for example, write it in a way that no one can modify the code and everyone will get the same answer. And there are some nice properties about it. I just think that realistically, the area would evolve a lot, and we have been working on this. We have this notion of a simple contract that we already have on our blockchain, and we are working on a non-Turing complete language, which basically gives programmers enough expressibility that you can do most of the things that you want to do, but you can also formally verify the programs, meaning that anyone who's concerned about security could actually have proofs that this program will do what it's meant to do, but a lot more importantly, it will not do anything else, right? So I think there will be more coming from our project about smart contracts. We have this notion of a simple contract where you can actually create digital assets on the network, and you can already do a lot with just creating digital assets. So I think there are two parts to it. One is that the question is, who is the owner and who has more power? Is it the user or is it the service provider? Right now, the power lies with the service providers because by default, they get the data. By default, they get to do whatever they want to do with it, right? We are flipping that. Users have more power, but they can choose to share a subset of their data with some apps, with explicit permission, and with much better guarantees for what the app can and cannot do, right? Because you are locally giving them those permissions. And then if you get data, your service provider, your app builder, your developer, if you get that data and you get the consent from a lot of users, you can try to do interesting things with it. A second version of this question that I get a lot is people try to link it with AI. And I think that's a deeper problem, right? The deeper problem is that AI algorithms tend to become better the more data they see, right? So there seems to be some sort of a fundamental clash here. And I think, again, I partly give this answer that with correct user consent, you can actually get data. The second thing is you'd be surprised by what AI algorithms can do just with your data, right? Like a friend of mine, he has this company where you download their app, they would just only locally process all of your pictures, and they're not sending any data to any cloud device, and you start searching for people's names and faces, and they can actually, it feels like magic, right? So AI algorithms would start getting better, and just your personal data, like the AI can learn somewhere else and then come and apply that learning on your data, on your terms, instead of you basically giving up all of your data to try and get benefits from some of this AI algorithms. Yep. So Coinscrum actually helped a lot with this. So Coinscrum, for those of you who don't know, it is, in my view, one of the best think tanks in DC for for basically educating the Congress or other regulators or even like the general public about this new technology. So we are a sponsor of Coinscrum. We've been funding them for the last 4 years, I think. And they've done an extremely, extremely good job. This particular alliance is less about, hey, is Coinscrum not doing something that we want them to do? It's more about some of the more prominent projects coming together and collaborating more with each other, right? Which wasn't happening through Coinscrum, in the sense that, yes, people would just give them money and then they would go off, do their work, high quality work that benefits everyone. This alliance is more about all of the companies who are in part working more closely with each other and putting up a joint face in front of the regulators. And Coinscrum is helping us in doing that.